When I was a child, growing up in Oxfordshire, I used to fall asleep listening to late-night stories on the radio. Not the kind that scared you out of your skin, but the kind that made the room feel quieter, the shadows feel deeper, and the night feel full of secrets. Welcome to SleepyTime Mysteries. Soft suspense, strange tales, and gentle stories for the midnight mind. Tonight's mystery begins. The first strange thing about the radio was not that it turned on by itself. It was that it seemed to know my name. I had bought it 3 days earlier from a small antique shop on the far side of town, the sort of place tucked between quieter businesses, where the windows were dusty and the clocks inside never seemed to agree with one another. I had gone in looking for nothing in particular. That is usually how such things begin. The shop smelled faintly of cedar, old paper, and rain-damp wool. It was late afternoon, and a grey drizzle had begun to patter against the front window. Lamps glowed softly in the corners, illuminating rows of strange and patient objects: brass candlesticks, cracked porcelain, framed maps, tarnished silver, and shelves of books whose titles had half faded into time. The radio was sitting alone on a low wooden table in the back room. It was a handsome little tabletop model, walnut-cased, with a curved top, a cloth speaker, and a brass dial the colour of old honey. It looked like the sort of radio that had once brought voices into dark living rooms on winter evenings, when families gathered near the fire and the world outside the windows fell away. There was something immediately familiar about it. Not familiar in the sense that I had seen that exact radio before, but familiar in the deeper way some things feel, as though they have been waiting at the edge of your life for quite some time. The shopkeeper appeared beside me so quietly that I nearly startled. He was a narrow man in a brown cardigan, with silver hair and the kind of voice that always seemed half lowered for the sake of old rooms. "That one still works," he said. "Does it?" I asked. He nodded. "At least, it listens well." I turned to ask him what that meant, but he was already wandering toward the front counter, leaving the words behind him like a loose thread. I bought the radio for $18. The shopkeeper wrapped it in brown paper, tied it with string, and as he handed it over, he said only this: "If it speaks, be polite." I laughed then, as one laughs at the peculiar habits of strangers. Had I known what was coming, I might not have laughed at all. The first night, nothing happened. I set the radio on a small table in my bedroom near the window, where rain tapped softly against the glass and the curtains stirred each time the wind slipped past the building. I lived alone in a narrow upstairs apartment, quiet except for the plumbing in the walls and the occasional footsteps overhead. My routines were simple. I read before bed. I made too much tea. I left lamps on longer than necessary. And like many people who claim they enjoy solitude, I sometimes felt its weight most heavily at night. I turned the radio's brass dial and heard only static, a soft sea of distant sound. Then, for a moment, music. Then silence again. On the second night, just after midnight, the radio crackled to life on its own. I was half asleep in the armchair by the window, a blanket over my knees, a book slipping from my hand. The room was lit only by a shaded lamp on the dresser and the pale shimmer of rainlight from outside. At first I thought the sound came from the storm, but then through the static came a voice. It was warm and clear, like an old announcer on a late-night broadcast. "Tomorrow," it said, "the blue umbrella will be left behind on the number 8 bus." That was all. A small click followed, and the radio went dark. I sat there listening to the rain. A blue umbrella on a city bus was not much of a prophecy. It sounded like the sort of nonsense the sleeping mind might invent to amuse itself. By morning, I had nearly decided I had dreamt it. But the next afternoon, while riding the number 8 across town, I noticed a blue umbrella propped against the seat beside me. At the next stop, the woman who had been sitting there rose in a hurry and stepped off without it. The bus pulled away. The umbrella remained. I remember staring at it as though it had been placed there deliberately for me. I did not take it. I only watched the rain bead on the window and felt a small, cold curiosity settle somewhere beneath my ribs. That night I waited for the radio. At 12:13 it came alive again. Static first, then the same voice. "Tomorrow, at 3:22 in the afternoon, the florist on Waverley Street will drop a glass vase." Then silence. The following day I found myself standing outside the florist on Waverley Street at 3:20, feeling ridiculous and faintly embarrassed. Through the window I could see a young man trimming stems behind the counter. Buckets of lilies and hydrangeas crowded the shop with colour. At precisely 3:22, someone called from the back. The young man turned too quickly. His elbow struck a tall, clear vase, and it fell. I heard it shatter even through the glass. There are moments in life when the world remains outwardly unchanged, and yet one's place within it quietly shifts. This was one of those moments. I returned home that evening with a curious mixture of dread and anticipation. I made tea and did not drink it. I checked the clock repeatedly. I turned on every lamp in the room as though light itself might keep things ordinary. At 12:13, the radio spoke again. "Tomorrow at 8:41 in the morning," said the voice, "Mr. Elias Wren will miss a telephone call he has been waiting to receive." Mr. Elias Wren. My name. I sat very still. There are few things stranger than hearing your own name spoken by something that should not know it. I had indeed been waiting for a call, not a particularly dramatic one, only a reply from my sister Clara, who lived several counties away, and with whom I had not spoken in nearly 11 months. We had not quarrelled exactly. Ours was the quieter kind of separation, the kind built not from one great argument, but from a series of missed chances, delayed apologies, and the stubborn hope that time itself might repair what neglect had worn thin. The next morning, at 8:39, I stepped into the hallway to collect the mail. When I returned at 8:42, the telephone light was blinking. Missed call. Clara. I thought of her name for a long time before I sat down. The radio did not speak again that night until later than usual, nearly 1 in the morning. When it did, the voice sounded softer somehow. "Tomorrow," it said, "you will decide whether to remain a listener or become part of the broadcast." Then silence. I did not know what that meant, and for the first time I considered carrying the radio back to the shop and leaving it there. Yet when morning came, I could not bring myself to move it. Instead, I took out a notebook and began writing down everything it had said. Blue umbrella, Waverley Street florist, the missed call from Clara. Then, beneath those entries, I wrote a question. What do you want from me? All day the apartment felt changed, as though the presence of the radio had bent the air slightly around it. Outside, the rain continued on and off in long silver curtains. Inside, the hours passed with the patient hush that rainy days sometimes carry. I found myself thinking not only of the radio, but of Clara. Our last conversation had been brief and brittle. She had invited me to visit in the autumn. I had said I was too busy. She had replied, "You're always too busy for the things that matter." I had answered poorly, too quickly, too defensively. Since then, our contact had narrowed to birthday messages and one holiday card, with more politeness than warmth. That evening, when darkness settled again at the window, I sat beside the radio and waited, with the notebook open on my lap. The voice came at exactly 12:13. "Tomorrow," it said, "at 6:10 in the evening, a letter will be found where no letter has been for many years." I frowned. A letter? Where? But the broadcast was over. The next day, I spent most of the afternoon distracted. At 5:50, I began looking through drawers, old boxes, shelves, coat pockets, anything that might hide a forgotten envelope. At 6:08, I almost gave up. Then I noticed something tucked behind a framed photograph on the mantel. The photograph had been there so long, I scarcely looked at it anymore. It showed Clara and me as children, sitting cross-legged on the carpet at our grandparents' house, listening to a radio nearly identical to the one now in my bedroom. Behind the frame was an envelope. My name was written on it in my mother's hand. She had been gone for 8 years. My fingers trembled a little as I opened it. Inside was a single page, folded twice. It was not dated, but I recognized at once when it must have been written, sometime after my father died, when my mother had begun to sort through old things and speak more often of what she called unfinished tenderness. The note was short. "If you and your sister ever grow distant," she had written, "do not be proud for too long. Loneliness hardens in silence. Love, when it waits, becomes shy. Speak before it forgets the sound of your voice." I sat down on the edge of the bed and read it again. Outside, evening rain whispered against the window. The apartment had never felt so quiet. That night, I did not wait for the radio to speak. Before midnight, I picked up the telephone and called Clara. She answered on the 4th ring. "Elias?" For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I said the most difficult and ordinary words in the world. "I'm sorry." She was quiet for so long that I thought perhaps the line had gone dead. Then she laughed, not because anything was funny, but because tears were already in her voice, and laughter was the bridge people sometimes use to cross into honesty. "I'm sorry too," she said. We spoke for nearly an hour, about nothing remarkable at first: the weather, her garden, a new bakery near her street, the old apartment building where we grew up. Then, gradually, about what had actually happened between us, how easy it had been to mistake delay for indifference, distance for finality, silence for safety. When the call ended, the room felt different. Not transformed exactly. Still the same rain, the same lamplight, the same radio by the window. And yet something within the room had softened. Something within me had softened too. At 12:13, the radio crackled on. I turned toward it slowly. The voice returned, calm as ever. "Tomorrow," it said, "the future will sound less lonely." This time, after the sentence, there was no click. Only the faintest murmur of distant music, as though another room in another time had briefly opened somewhere beyond the speaker cloth. Then came one final line. "Thank you for listening." The radio fell silent. It never made another prediction after that. In the weeks that followed, I kept it where it was, on the table by the bedroom window. Sometimes I turned the dial and found old music drifting in from somewhere far away. Sometimes only static. Sometimes, on rainy nights, I thought I heard the edge of a voice just beyond the noise, too faint to make out. Clara and I spoke every Sunday after that. In spring, I went to visit her. She met me at the station, carrying a blue umbrella. Neither of us mentioned the coincidence, though I noticed it, and I believe she did too. We spent the afternoon talking as though a door long stuck had finally opened. It occurs to me now that perhaps the radio was never predicting the future in the way I first imagined. Perhaps it was doing something gentler. Perhaps it was tuning me toward a tomorrow that had been waiting patiently all along. Toward a life in which I answered the call. Toward a life in which I listened more carefully. Toward a life in which silence no longer mistook itself for peace. The radio remains with me still. It glows softly some evenings when the room is dark and the rain moves across the window in silver threads. I have not asked it to speak again. Some mysteries are less about solving than about receiving. Less about answers than about the quiet changes they leave behind. And even now, on certain nights, when the city has gone hushed and sleep is not yet near, I sit beside the old walnut radio and listen to the static. It sounds, in its own way, a little like time, a little like weather, a little like memory. And once in a while, if the room is quiet enough, it almost sounds like tomorrow. You've been listening to SleepyTime Mysteries, soft suspense, strange tales, and gentle stories for the midnight mind. If tonight's story kept you company, you're always welcome back. Until next time, sleep well and listen closely.